when we are looking at deterrence and conflict prevention, the word deterrence actually started post the Second World War, and when the Americans they first exploded the bomb, and then the Russians got the bomb, and then of course we got into mutually assured destruction, etc., etc. And then the terms were really used as war avoidance tools. That if you wage war, then we will punish you in a similar manner, or if you use atomic weapons, then our atomic weapons will deter you. So the deterrence came into that mode. But once the Soviet Union disintegrated, in Europe today, you really don't find the usage of the word deterrence coming in anymore. What they are really talking about now is they are looking at conflict prevention. And they're looking at different types of threats. They're looking at cyber, they're looking at terrorism, they're looking at small localized wars. And if it is a small localized war, how can we stop it from occurring? Or if it has occurred, how can we best control it and get it to close in the fastest possible time? They're looking into the threats from the cyber domain and how to deal with terrorism. And one of the issues which they have discussed about terrorism is that we can actually reduce the impact by taking defensive measures. I really don't know how that will work, because so long you can keep taking defensive measures, but at some point the terrorist wins. He gets through. He gets that one bomb through. You may stop 99, the 100th gets through. Then what do? What will the Americans do today if another 9/11 takes place from Afghanistan? Will they go back? I have my doubts. So those are the issues which I think we will discuss now over the next 45 minutes. We have four very, very eminent speakers with us. We have General Jasmeet Litter, who requires no introduction. He was the chair of the last session, but a very, very renowned general with great experience with the United Nations. We have General Prakash Menon, my course mate, again a very renowned soldier and a very seasoned academic also now. He speaks and writes a great deal. He writes books. He comes onto television panels, and a very well-read soldier scholar, I will say. Prakash, welcome. Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee, he has been the permanent rep of India to the United Nations. He continues here. And we have another very seasoned diplomat, Ambassador Arvind Gupta. He was also the head of the IDSA, and currently he's the director in Vivekanand India Foundation. He's been a deputy NSA also. So when it comes to experience and practicing the craft, so to say, all four of them are outstanding. So the sequence which we will have is, I'll start with General Litter, then we'll go over to the two ambassadors, Ambassador Mukherjee and Ambassador Arvind Gupta, and finally I'll close with Prakash Menon. I'll request each of the speakers to take about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll wind up. General Litter, over to you.
Okay. You see, the concept of deterrence, as I look at it, has changed. I mean, the word deterrence came when the nuclear things came. But over a period of time, the conflict has spread so wide in terms of climate, cyber, information war, political, whatever, name it. So when you talk about deterrence and you talk about deterring, it's again taking it to the last, it's a perception battle. So when you talk about deterrence, you can have any amount of capacity or capability. You can have huge. North Korea has got huge number of stockpiles and elsewhere. But capability comes with political resolve. And political resolve today is a perception. You can have a huge stockpile or huge thing. So what are you trying to deter, as I look at it? The very concept of deterrence has changed. What are you trying to deter? So if you build up a huge nuclear, the way you look at a nuclear deterrence, and is that enough deterrence? It hasn't. In our case, it hasn't helped, nor it can happen in Pakistan, nor anything else. And then we talk about these windows under the deterrence, under the nuclear things like that, etc., etc. So I think when we talk about the threats, the deterrence gets related to that. So if it is irregular warfare, what deterrence are you looking for? Irregular warfare. Pakistanis just cannot say that, look, because we have tactical nuclear weapons, we can get away with murder. Similarly, somebody else cannot say this, we have this sort of deterrence. So I think the concept of deterrence, both the capability and the capacity. And in the capability comes the will, not only will to do it, but the will as perceived by the person who's perceiving it, and that comes to conflict prevention. I personally feel that the word deterrence itself and the concept has got diluted over a period of time. And we need to relook at it when we relate at conflict prevention as to what it is. Seeing in isolation and purely looking at a kinetic military angle, I think it is not helping anywhere. Otherwise, you won't have Taliban back in Afghanistan elsewhere. So, what is the concept of deterrence itself? I'm not going to give an it. I'm not even going to take 10, 12 minutes, Dhruv, because I'm just trying to define certain parameters as I look at from outside, throw up food for thought, and see how the other people react and things like that. I definitely feel when we talk about conflict prevention is really preventive diplomacy. And that's where the diplomats come in. Not only preventive diplomacy is also to the military, going from the last time. So when we talk about conflict prevention, deterrence is one side, which is the kinetic part, and conflict prevention is the soft side. CBMs, talks, various building and all. After all, now today we have a ceasefire on the LC, which is being well appreciated by everybody, immaterial of what the pluses or minuses are. I have no solution for that. So when we talk about deterrence and conflict prevention, they go hand in one. So what are we looking for? Are we looking at deterrence? Has the concept changed? Or are we looking at preventing a conflict now? Which is the first phase. If you want to grow economically, if you want to do well, if you want to reduce human distress, what have we done on the LC today? Finally, we have gone on to the ceasefire. We've all been commanders at various levels. We have faced ups and downs of various things and all that. We've all made tall claims. We've all suffered also. Elsewhere, there is status quo, etc. So we a very honest internal check, internal audit as to really was this deterrence? Is that concept of deterrence is really what we are looking at, or is the whole concept of deterrence has changed in my view? And how then you look at deterrence at various spectrum of conflict and areas of conflict and define different tools to deter and to try and prevent conflict. I'll leave it at that, Dhruv. I can come back again based on what somebody else comes up, but I'll leave it at that, my initial thoughts. Thank you.
I'd like to mention deterrence is not really confined just to the military or to the diplomacy. You can use economic sanctions, etc., also as part of a deterrence strategy or anything else. But basically, it is to make the opponent change behavior, to simply change their behavior and not to go on a particular path. Now I invite Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee for your views, please.
Well, thank you, General Katoch. On deterrence and conflict prevention, I think in the real world that we are all living in, the fact that a country has a nuclear weapon is a deterrent. Other countries do not very likely provoke a country which has nuclear weapons. In the case of Asia, there are three countries which haven't signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty: Israel, India, Pakistan, and yet all three of us coexist, and nobody wants to really tangle with any of us. So that is a way of deterrence. Is it sustainable or not is a question which I think could be discussed, but that is a fact. The second way of deterrence, which I see and which may be valid, is the deterrence between, say, China and Japan. I mean, we know that China and Japan are antagonistic states. That much is obvious. But yet, the Japanese have used a method of deterrence without being a nuclear weapon power, although they have the American nuclear umbrella, which is the Japanese investments in China. Almost the huge figure, I think almost 40% of the foreign investments in China are from Japan. So how do countries use economic policies and especially investments as a form of deterrence, of deterring an attack on them or destabilizing them, is again something that is a model. It's out there in the real world, and I think that holds a lesson for itself. The third, of course, is military profiles and power, and I think that in this. We've seen the impact of military power as a deterrent in the past, but as has been said by the chair, the nature of conflict has changed. They are now non-state actors, individual actors who will those be deterred by military profiles and power? I think that is something that should be discussed. I don't think that individuals and even non-state actors are easily deterred by military power. If that were so, then how did what happened in Afghanistan happen? I mean, this is something that the biggest military power in the world is forced to leave by this grouping called the Taliban and their supporters. And of course, in this discussion, I think the chair very rightly put it even in the previous session, there is a domain and a dimension which has come for which deterrence and then conflict prevention has to be discussed, and that is the technology dimension. In 1945, when many of the issues of deterrence were discussed and states moved into various structures, including the mutual assured destruction issue. At that time, technology was not so dominant. Of course, the nuclear bomb had been exploded 6 weeks after the UN Charter was signed, but the UN Charter never really took that into account. Now, today we are in 2021, and apart from the nuclear bomb and the refinement of nuclear weapons, we have technologies which are deployed in outer space. We have technologies which are being deployed in the man-made domain of cyberspace, and yet we do not know how we can have a deterrence to threats which come from outer space or from cyberspace, and how to use technology as not only as a provocation but also as a deterrent, because technology has both sides to it. So this is something that I think will preoccupy people who look at the nature of conflicts in the future, especially in technologies which affect our day-to-day lives. And there, I think the world of cyberspace, cyber technologies will play a very big role. Now, in this very sort of conceptual scenario that I've painted so far, the question arises for India. What does India do in this context? And I think in this context, India's primary and main priority has to be to become the master of its own resources and fate and investments and the entire concept of what is called self-reliance, which today we have a policy of Atmanirbharta. But the policy of self-reliance, which came out of our experience of colonial rule, but which in the 21st century has assumed a different dimension. Self-reliance, I would say, is one form of deterrence as well. And in self-reliance, we need to look at a holistic convergence, which I think is being attempted to be done, of linking our military threat issues, our cyber threat issues, our issues of the maritime domain, maritime security, all of them in a holistic manner in which we become a kind of, we have a holistic response to these threats and on how to deter these threats. But as was said in the previous panel by General Liddell, we cannot go it alone. That, I think, is a hard reality, that we need linkages, we need interaction with like-minded other countries and other entities. I think we are now seeing an era where For example, this entire way of countering the financing of terrorism is using the Financial Action Task Force. Most people think that that is just the state. No, it is not just the state. It is actually a whole network of private financial institutions. So the linkages between state and beyond state, between state and private sector has already become a part of our day-to-day life when we look at, for example, deterring cyber crimes, deterring the use of finances for terrorism. So will this pattern, this paradigm grow in the future? I think it will, because the nature of threats which need to be deterred is, as we have said, not only limited to states, but it goes beyond states. And therefore, I would like to end by saying that in preventing conflicts and in deterring conflicts, we need to also look beyond the conventional way, which has been through treaties, through obligations, through the rule of law. We have gone down this road. But one problem that we have faced, and we have seen has been faced by other countries as well, is how do you enforce these pieces of paper on which countries have signed? How do you enforce it? How do you make it have teeth? And I think that enforcement will require us to look at beyond state, to look at institutions, at corporations, which will have to become partners in conflict prevention and deterrence. So these are my ideas. I'd like to sort of put them out on the table and listen to what the other panelists say before coming back if necessary. Thank you.
Now, may I request Dr. Gupta for your views, please?
Thank you. I want to start by thanking General Panun and Mr. Sanjeev Chopra for inviting me here to this very important panel discussion. And I think our discussion now is really a continuation of the discussion in the earlier panel, which was about the nature of conflict. So I think it is almost, if you look at the history and take a long sweep of it, conflicts will always be there. Conflicts have always been there. It's really a question of how do you manage conflicts and how do you prevent conflicts. And deterrence is only one tool, and probably I would say a small tool of really conflict prevention. And I think, as earlier panelists have also hinted, that nature of deterrence itself is changing as technology changes, as the geostrategic landscape changes, as the actors who are involved change, state actors, non-state actors, new state actors, new non-state actors, the links between them, the private sector, the government, etc. And now with the technology growing by leaps and bounds and whose nature we don't quite understand, also the fact that there are so much of identity politics that's happening. Ashok talked about linguistic nationalism, I think, in the last panel. So we're seeing that threat scenario is becoming more and more granular. So there is no one concept of deterrence which will work. And we have seen this terrorism we cannot deter. We might be able to have some impact, maybe temporarily, but it doesn't work. And if, as you mentioned in the last panel, Pakistan, if it is an ideological state, then its thinking is going to be very different. So nuclear weapons, yes, we have experimented now with last 20 years for this deterrence, but I think there is still a problem. As we have discussed in many other panels, and I think Prakash has also written about it many times, that the way different actors involved understand deterrence, that itself changes. What deters for me may not really be the same as the other person may have a totally different view. And if you look at the whole literature on deterrence, and particularly the academic scholarly literature, which has been developed essentially in the West because of this Cold War and nuclear weapons, etc. 1994, when Kissinger was writing about deterrence, and they were trying to understand, when do you say deterrence has succeeded? There is no agreement even today. When do you say that deterrence has succeeded? I mean, Kissinger at that time wrote that deterrence is essentially an esoteric intellectual exercise. And this is wrote in 1994. So that much for their faith in deterrence. If you look at even this, the Balakot example, look at what Lieutenant General Kidwai had to say in the IISS seminar. And for him, what we thought where deterrence, we are trying to add some credibility to our deterrence. He says that you have done a big mistake. It indicates your muddled strategic thinking. So I think the way people look at deterrence and particularly adversaries, it is so different. And so in the absence of a dialogue, it is very difficult to be sure as to whether deterrence is working or not working. And when you talk about deterrence, because in this sense it's essentially a military, mostly a military concept, but of course the politics also comes in because the military and war and military and politics are related. So the political factors also come in, ideological factors also come in. So I think in the light of all this, deterrence does become a somewhat an ambiguous concept, and ambiguity is also inbuilt in deterrent. You don't want to clearly say what you mean by deterrence. So I think, but yet it is, I think, in the kind of world that we live in, the realist world that Ashok talked about, it is perhaps a necessary evil. It doesn't fully ensure or guarantee against, the behavior of, unacceptable behavior of an adversary. And yet, because you are living in a nuclearized world, you are living in a world where new military technologies are, taking birth every day. You have to remain, you have to catch up with that world, and you cannot really believe in the goodwill of the adversary, and you have to really take your own national interest into account. And so I think you have to have deterrent capabilities. And the discussion has so far shown in this panel that deterrent capabilities go beyond the military capabilities. So I think we should really, when we talk about deterrence, we should be clear as to what we are talking about. And unfortunately, it is not always possible to be absolutely clear what we are talking about. I mean, even in military scenarios, I think all of you are military people here, very experienced people. We know that you can build a scenario, but you really cannot control the scenario. You cannot really control the scenario. Deterrence also has the same problem. You can start something, but you cannot control the escalation. So first and second rungs, you may be able to do it. General Kidwai talked about third and fourth and fifth rungs. Then what do you do? So there are these problems inherent in the concept of deterrence. And this we see not just in the context of nuclear weapons. We also see in the context of normal life, crime and punishment. I mean, punishment is a deterrent, but the crime still takes place. And whether a society has, less of a crime, or it depends on not just the amount of punishment that you can mete out, but also many other factors. So I think other factors, and that's where we come to the conflict and the conflict prevention and conflict resolution, which is an extremely important part of this whole concept. So when we talk about deterrence, we must, as this panel does, talk in the context of conflict prevention. And I think Ashok has talked a lot about dialogue and multilateralism and the treaties and so on and so forth. That is, of course, very, very important. But unless you have an inherent comprehensive national power of your own, you cannot really enforce what you have to, you cannot really enforce behavior on anybody else. And if you look at the last 5-7 years, and if you look at Prime Minister Modi's efforts, I think we should take note of 2 or 3 things which are very relevant. One thing that he has started talking about is the reformed multilateralism. So there is some sort of essential, some necessity of how we look at multilateralism, global governance, and trying to reform it. But how will this reform come about? I think that is where India and India's civilizational identity, it is connect with the rest of the world, and it's also our own philosophy, our own heritage, etc., that counts. Today, it is very important then on issues like deterrence, on issues like conflict, we must build our own narrative. And this narrative, there are elements of this narrative all across, strewn all across our our heritage. You look at Ramayana or you look at Mahabharata, it is all about force. It's all about use of force, but use of force in a certain way. So I think we have to be sure that in dealing with this very complicated world that we are facing, while we continue to transform ourselves both in the terms of hard military power and economic power, etc., but also we must build a power of the narrative. A power of the narrative which is inherent in concepts like the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, for instance, or the Vishwaguru, that concept that Prime Minister Modi talks about. These are not empty concepts, but these concepts need to be filled up with content which is relevant for today. So I think on the deterrence and conflict prevention, perhaps we should have to talk about both these concepts simultaneously. And on conflict prevention, we must bring to bear all our experience of dealing massively, massive experience of dealing with conflicts in a diverse society that we have had. It must be all brought together and must be extended. So I think that is a way to probably go forward.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. I totally agree with you because we have to look into now peace-building measures, conflict prevention, etc., and how best that can be done. But a very interesting observation you made on Kissinger, I've read that quote of his. Let me put it in this way. The Americans invaded Iraq, and they did so because they said they may have nuclear weapons, knowing fully well they didn't have nuclear weapons. They have not invaded North Korea. And the reason they have not invaded North Korea the way they did it in Iraq is because they fear North Korea actually has a nuclear weapon. I think deterrence in some aspects, it does work. It keeps people a bit safer. I'm not saying North Korea is an ideal model, but for them, at least we can say that Kim is safe because he had a nuclear weapon. Otherwise, the Americans would have taken him out the way they took out Saddam Hussein. Now, may I invite General Prakash Menon for your views, please. Prakash, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. The rise of deterrence in the lexicon of strategic discourse was actually driven by the advent of nuclear weapons. And therefore, we must understand that the word deterrence has to have a context. What are we wanting to deter? That would actually change the entire conception of deterrence itself. So in the world of nuclear weapons, there's been enough discussion, a lot of nuclear ideology, philosophy has been put out. But today we are being confronted not with nuclear weapons as also, but with the whole range of technological products which defy the ability to deter. But in a sense, deterrence remains about a combination of a defensive and an offensive ability so that nobody does you any harm. It's a combination of this, and that remains the same. So the nature of deterrence has not changed. The character of deterrence is changing in the sense that today you don't have to actually send a missile to bring down a power station. You can actually do it by cyber. Bypass all the armies and which they have, and do it actually at a flip at the speed of light. So technology today has forms of power which can do damage and destruction, which was unimaginable, let's say, 30 to 40 years ago. But now we see that is in action. It is the world in which we live today. So the question when we talk about deterrence is, what are we trying to deter? So in the Indo-Pak context or in the Indo-Pak Chinese context, obviously we are trying to deter military conflict. But it is so, a military conflict brings in the notion of nuclear weapons because it will have to factor in the fact that all three are nuclear weapon powers. It is unlikely that military conflict of a substantial can possibly be fought amongst these powers without actually nuclear weapons coming into play, or without even one nation actually having a doubt that somebody has alerted their nuclear weapons. So the question really is, when we talk about conflict prevention and deterrence, I think we need to understand what type of conflicts are we talking about. If we are talking about the type that we define a conflict as between the militaries, where militaries are involved, then obviously deterrence has a nuclear shadow over it. But if we are talking about conflicts which actually are derived from some other sources, other forms of power, then the very definition of conflict itself actually is changing, because either one is perpetually in conflict these days, because that is what is happening in the cyber world, or have you heard me? Can you hear me?
But,
Yeah, can you hear
it's
me?
okay now. It's okay now.
Okay, yeah, probably I have an unstable internet. So now we are actually, if we really wanting to consider, what we have to look at is the other forms of power, because the thing of nuclear weapons, and if nuclear weapons come into play, what will happen? I don't think this thing about even one nuclear weapon is enough to actually the power which has got the maximum durability is an indication of what nuclear weapons has done as far as deterrence is concerned. And India has always believed that numbers do not matter. And we also know there are enough scientific studies now to prove that even if there is an exchange of 30 to 40 weapons, or maybe 50 weapons between India, Pakistan, India and China, that is enough to actually create a climatic and global potential threat over the long term. So the idea that you can use nuclear weapons and get away with it is... I'm just switching off my video because I think my internet is unstable. Just tell me you can hear me now.
Totally audible. Please carry on.
Okay, thanks. So the idea that we can use nuclear weapons in a first strike, because the numbers already have exceeded what you earn, because the first strike destroy everything unless we talk about tactical nuance, and then actually embrace the idea that you can able to control escalation. Political leaders, these are all intellectual academic imaginations. They cannot possibly last the reality which fails. And political leaders are quite aware of it. They have so far all over the world not ventured to go into a situation between nuclear powers where nuclear weapons can be alerted, and they are aware of it, which will mean the nature of leadership. But the Indian text and the subcontinental context is a little complicated. And that complication comes from the fact that our neighbor Pakistan uses terror as a tool which of its foreign policy under the nuclear shadow. And that becomes a very complicated affair. Because although the trigger might be a terrorist strike, and depending upon what that terrorist strike does, and depending upon the emotional surge of the Indian populace and its effect on the political leaders, the reaction cannot possibly be something which can be said, no, we must be worried about nuclear weapons and so on. And I think India has already demonstrated that. So the greatest danger now for India, I think, in my view, is the fact that here you have a state where they can actually carry out today a terrorist attack in the Hindi heartland, the Indo-Gangetic plain, where the political and religious polarization is at its apex. They have to just choose the target very carefully, and then they can expect that the Indians will do things to themselves, and they probably might gamble that because they are doing to themselves, they're not able to do anything to us. It is a risk that they have to take. But we hope that with Balakot and Uri, such thinking does prevail in that country. But we must be prepared because we cannot determine the actions of that state. And therefore, since sudden escalation is a problem for us, and especially in the Indo-Pak situation, not as, with China, we need to actually have whatever we can, whether in terms of our lines of communications, at least those must be working. They must be able by NSA to pick up the phone and speak to the NSA on the other side, calm things down. And those mechanisms are probably in place. And therefore, the control of a conflict requires a dialogue. If India or Pakistan thinks that they're nuclear powers and they're not nuclear powers, they're too close to each other, and they can continue to say we're kuti, so we won't talk, I think the leadership will have to rethink that because they put both countries in danger. It might be good for domestic politics. It is not good for national interests. So conflict prevention requires engagement, discussion, mechanisms, which we must strive for. Because the danger is too much. And let us not believe, like Pakistan, that we can control something when that they can use a small what they call a tactical nuclear weapon, and that which will not have a strategic effect. Every weapon can be judged by its effect, not because you call it tactical, it becomes tactical. A use of any nuclear weapon will have a strategic, because it would have been the use of nuclear weapons for the first time after it's used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It will have a global effect. And the point that Pakistan gamble on India being actually careful about how it retaliates, I think our nuclear doctrine is very clear on that. So understand the political rhetoric which normally accompanies the atmosphere of conflict must be seasoned by mature communications between people who are level-headed on both sides. And that is an absolute necessity. Thank you very much, Dhruv. I think I've finished and taken my 10 minutes.
Thank you, Prakash. Now, you've all heard four sets of views by four very distinguished speakers. I think the emphasis really has been on deterrence and not on the second part, conflict prevention. So now we have about 15 minutes more. May I request each of the panelists to speak now? Don't use the word deterrence now. We'll leave that aside. If we have to go for conflict prevention solutions, and I want to look at two hotspots. One is in West Asia, and the second is the cross-strait crisis. Just these two. India will handle separately. So if we have to look at these two, could I have your suggestions as to what could be conflict prevention scenarios? Because both these scenarios will impact India in a very, very negative manner. I'll start with General Litter, and again through the ambassadors, and I'll end with General Menon. Litter, sir, all yours.
Dhruv, you'll have to come again. I didn't hear your first portion. You said you're looking for conflict preventions, one in West Asia, second where?
Vic, the cross-strait crisis, China taking over Taiwan.
Okay. Okay, now that's really raising the bar for which I don't think I have any answers to that. But let's come again. Coming back to the previous setting about the regional and the international structures and policies. And what Arvind was talking some time back is when you want to build up anything, and you want to be part of global governance, you want to be part of it, you want to reform the world and things like that, then you got to get practical, hard reality on the move forward. And the two things cannot go together. One is that you look purely kinetic and purely deterrence and things like that. Other is how you look at elements of national power to project elsewhere. Indo-Pacific, conflict prevention, etc. My views personally it's becoming very, very murky, absolutely. And I don't know, Americans, after pulling out from Afghanistan, what desperate steps are they taking? This AUKUS, I don't find it taking off at all. It has brought more ill will than goodwill, and Europe is nearly up in arms. It is a revival, literally, of the World War II era, with France literally talking about Napoleon and the Britishers talking about Nelson, and that's not the way we should be going about it. So that's no conflict prevention. Conflict prevention really is more of defensive, more of dialogue, more of etc., and not by military alliances. I think post Afghanistan, everybody understands that military muscle by itself and that to technology related prowess cannot suppress humanity, cannot suppress human aspirations. They will still come elsewhere. President Xi has been sending different signals. Yesterday he said Taiwan will be part of China, not be part of China, etc. It's very, very murky waters. Americans, to be very frank, where they use India the way they feel like. When they want, they make India inside and make it Indo-Pacific, and when they just leave you out. So in Afghanistan as well as AUKUS, India is nowhere on the thing. And when they find conveniently, they'll get you on quad. So I think this whole concept of alliance is a big myth. And sooner we understand this myth, the better. There is nobody going to come to our aid, and we've got to build ourselves. We got to look at conflict prevention measures ourselves and all that. West Asia definitely is one area. Israel has been going far, far beyond his capability. This Gaza attacks, but they were that time Trump administration overlook it. That's not the way humanity should be going at all. I think India has always been supporting the Palestinian cause. India has always been supporting two-state theory, and that is the way it is. I think use of force by any unilateral use of force outside the international peace and security system should not be encouraged by India at all. India stands, as Ashok said, for human rights, and we've been actually right through the Palestinians. It's down the line, we've changed our strategy. While we can have alliances with Israel, but it is not a binary or a linear assessment at all. I think India should continue to support its human rights aspirations of the people suppressed, whichever part of the world they are. And I think these military alliances, we need to be very, very careful on the way we go forward. And I'll leave it at that.
Ambassador Mukherjee, may I have your views on the same subject without using two words? I don't want deterrence to come in, and I don't want the military to come in. Now, leaving that aside, what will be your suggestions for a way forward?
Well, on conflict prevention, when we look at West Asia, for example, you see already in play a conflict prevention mechanism, which is symbolized by what the Americans have called the Abraham Accords. Now, the Abraham Accords have brought together Arab countries which are willing to not only recognize the right of Israel to exist, but also to collaborate with Israel in expanding conflict prevention footprint in West Asia. Now, in this context, I think it's important for us to just ask one question, which is what is the ability of the partners of this exercise of conflict prevention to actually make a difference on the ground? And I would agree with what General Lidder has just said, that we need to look at the correlation between the ability of the people who enter into conflict prevention mechanisms such as the Abraham Accords and their ability to influence the situation on the ground. And in West Asia, on the ground, I am one of those who would argue that boxing in the Palestinians has actually radicalized a part of the Palestinian population, which is now being used to tar the entire Palestinian people as being part of a radical Hamas movement. When it started in 1948, and India was there right from the beginning, we know that the Palestinians were like the Indians. they were not radicalized and they were not wearing their religion on their sleeve. They were, and in my own diplomatic experience, the Palestinians I have come across are the most educated, moderate people that I've met among the Arab people. So I think that this whole business of conflict prevention has to take into account the impact of the moves that are made on the ground. And I think that there is a disconnect in West Asia, as I see it, between the people who are proposing a conflict prevention mechanism, the Abraham Accords, and what is happening on the ground. And here I will not go into the reality of the ground in both Saudi Arabia and in Egypt and in the United Arab Emirates. Those of us who have worked in some of these countries know that there is a mismatch between what the leadership of these countries projects and what the ground reality among their native populations is. And I think that it's important for people who are outside this region to understand this point. In terms of India, and I just want to make this point, it's very interesting to note that although we sit in the UN Security Council, we have not been able to float a single initiative on either Syria or on Palestine or on Yemen. So the question arises, why? And the answer, I think, is quite obvious. It's because we do not have the privilege of being a permanent veto power of the UN Security Council, which our Prime Minister wants to reform through the reform multilateralism. So that's West Asia. And as far as India is concerned, West Asia, as you pointed out, General Katoch, in your remarks earlier, we have stakes in West Asia. We have stakes in the freedom of navigation through Aden all the way up to Mumbai. We have stakes in the Straits of Hormuz being kept open for our energy supplies. We have stakes in the 8 million Indians who are working, passport holders from India in that region, and the fact that they remit $40 billion a year to our economy by themselves without being forced to. So I think that these are stakes which actually should make India part of the conflict prevention mechanism in West Asia, but for some reason we are not able to do so. In the case of the China-Taiwan issue, I think that when we look at it, there is a bilateral conflict prevention mechanism at work. The Chinese diplomat who was my counterpart in New York is the head of their Taiwan diplomacy today. And knowing him and knowing how their system works in communist China, I think that there is a ebb and flow. Right now, because of the politics, the outcome of the political elections in Taiwan, we have a party which probably is more robust. And therefore, there is a profile from Beijing which is also robust. But there is an ebb and flow because all said and done, they are the same people. And I think we don't need to look very far to understand what I mean by when we just have to look at the response of both Taiwan and the communist China to the ruling of the UN UNCLOS tribunal on the South China Sea dispute. They both have the same response. So therefore, I think that for those of us who are outside this dispute, we should be cognizant that these two actually are cut from the same cloth. It's only that they have an issue of ideology which separates them. And I think that it's important for us in India to recognize it because all said and done, it was our friends in the Republic of China, today's Taiwan, who were our military allies in the Second World War, for whom our soldiers actually spent time fighting against the Japanese and so on. And it is just one of those historical issues which are being reopened nowadays, which created this convergence between India and China, and then the great debacle of 1962. So I think that the Straits issue, as far as I see it, is going to be resolved in a conflict prevention mode bilaterally between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan. And I don't think anyone, even with however powerful they are militarily, will actually play a role in preventing conflict between these two. They will use it. As General Lidder says, people will use these troubled waters for their own purposes. But I think we have to be aware that where people are being used and for what purpose are people being used. Thank you.
Just as an aside, I think I was with Admiral Sinha also, and when we had gone to China, and in one of the weaker moments, the Middle Peace officer who was actually with us, and it was dinner time, and we asked him, I said, will you chaps take over Taiwan? And he says, no, we are not strong enough. And then he added, when we are strong enough, we will. They had absolutely no doubts in their minds. Dr. Gupta.
Not a good chair asking very difficult questions.
No, just 2 to 4 minutes. We have
And
got,
no, I think
I've got 8 minutes, 4 minutes each.
yeah.
1 minute for me.
I think the
Oh, 2 minutes, sir. There will be Q&A.
yeah, there'll be Q&A. No, I think as we have been discussing, conflict prevention requires a dialogue. Now, this dialogue is very difficult in both cases, because in the case of Taiwan, I mean, this is not really a dispute between China and the US. It's more like a power game. If today, for instance, China and US made up, Taiwan will be sorted out. Taiwan will simply be taken over and the story will be over. So we will have to see how the US power evolves, both in in West Asia and in Indo-Pacific. And that is where I think these issues are connected with that. So I don't see any easy way of resolving the Taiwan question. And Xi has said again and again, and now they are strong enough, probably they will take over Taiwan at some point in time. If not now, maybe 5 years later, 10 years later, because they'll have to do their calculations. But what will be the answer? And what will the US do and the rest of the world do? That, of course, is still, that is the ambiguity. And that is the ambiguity of which the Chinese are taking advantage of. So they're testing the waters at this point of time. There is no solution there. But the only one way that you could handle this is really, go back. I think it was General Leader who talked about Napoleon and, going back to the history. Because today the Chinese are constructing a new world order in their own image. And sometimes they seem to be behaving like a rogue state. So how do you deal with a rogue state? That is something that we have to come to agreement with. But that is not very easy, because there are other factors involved here. Then it comes to West Asia. I mean, Palestine issue was mentioned, but let us also not forget that, again, when we talk about Israel, we are actually talking about Israel backed by the US. If tomorrow the Israel-US equation changes, I think Iran and Israel equation will also change. So that is also connected with the US power and US behavior. That is one. The second point is the Iranian reaction is also premised over the fact that the Israelis have the nuclear weapons. So they are always going to justify by saying that Israelis have a nuclear weapon, though they haven't come out openly with this, clandestinely, but everybody knows that Israelis have the nuclear weapon. So but there is a possibility in some future, I mean, perhaps a dialogue between between Israel and Iran. That is what the international community should be working for. After all, some kind of a dialogue did happen, in which, of course, Israel was not there. But this whole dialogue that happened on nuclear weapons program of Israel, which Trump walked out. But that was, I think, a good beginning. Maybe that is the way to expand the process and put some pressure on Israel. I think Israel also needs some pressure, which is not yet there.
General Menon, 1 minute for you, sir. After that,
So
there will be 2 minutes of
Taiwan,
Q&A.
Yeah, so political power is a mind game. They're composites of various forms, but it is a mind game. So as far as Taiwan is concerned, Chinese are playing a mind game. And of course, it is debatable about whether they can merely take over and then rule over so many millions of people. I don't think that China would actually try to attempt that, because you can't forget that the people you have to subjugate. So we leave it at that. As far as West Asia is concerned, I think two things are there. What is India's interest? India's interest is about its energy sources and it's about its diaspora. And maybe the third, that the winds of jihadi ideology doesn't float from there to us. We cannot get influence in the conflict itself, but we need to protect these three interests. And that's all I have to say. Thank you, Dhruv. Less than a minute, huh?
Thank you. Perfect. For a distinguished audience like this, it's not a Q&A. We'll just have your comments. Sir, we'll start with you. 5 more. Okay. Could we have a mic, please? Yeah, please. Jalkatozu. Sir, these are comments, free comments, anybody who wishes to give, right? It is not a Q&A. Sir.
Okay, comments are better than Q&A. I would like to remind the audience of what Brigadier Desmond Hayne said a long time ago. Battles are won or lost in the mind before they are won or lost on the ground. I find these discussions on this topic and the previous one very pacific. Is it that after the Battle of Kalinga, we in India have become passive? You mentioned, you talked about deterrence, that's fine. But you also mentioned we should be economically strong. Not only should we be economically strong, we should get together with other friendly nations and break the Chinese economy to the extent possible. We are not doing that. Today, India is still trading with the enemy. There is no doubt that China is our enemy. Why are we still trading with them? At least we should have a timeline by which all economic and financial transactions with China must stop and get together with friendly countries to reduce China's economy and financial power to the very minimum. We need to have defense preparedness by being strong. And that doesn't have anything to do with it. It's a deterrence in any way. So we need to be slightly offensive in some way, rather than nature abhors the vacuum. If we are not strong, somebody will take over. So this is what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'll get back to you, Colonel Sajjad. Yep. The mic was closer here.
Thank you, sir. 2 years back, I came to India. I went for purchasing some parts for my computer because it's not working. And I found in all the shops Chinese parts. I asked one shopkeeper, why are you selling Chinese? He says, sir, the shop is only Indian, everything else is Chinese. So that's what I want to say. We know and you know there is a danger in whatever form. In 71, we are massacred because we are not prepared. So are you getting your new generation prepared psychologically, physically, mentally, morally? It's very important, sir. We are living in dangerous world. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. General Sharma, before that, I would just like to state, Colonel Sajjad, I had the honor and the privilege of writing a book on the Liberation War with him. And all the stories which we wrote together many years ago made us our friendship, and he is one of the greatest people I have seen in the subcontinent. May you kindly acknowledge it.
I
General
just
Sharma.
want to comment on the two flashpoints that you alluded to, West Asia. I think without being sounded anti-US, unless the US is persuaded to get back to GCPOA, I don't think we will see the future of any conflict in West Asia. When Israel is already a declared nuclear power state, nobody is making a noise about Israel, and every other day they have been fishing out their scientists and sort of launching cyber attacks into their nuclear facilities. How do we expect Iran, if we put ourselves in the shoes of Iranians, to be a secure state? Point one. Point two, even North Korea. Why did Americans walk out of the six-party talks? And I'm privy to a lot of discussion that even Russians have been telling them, Chinese have been telling them, let's resume this dialogue. But they never want to enter that dialogue. what is the reason for Americans, rather than going into bilateral kind of a dialogue with Kim and then actually it leads nowhere. So unless this is resumed, I don't think there will be any peace there. In regard to Taiwan, you see, the Chinese had started the strategy of Finlandization of it, Taiwan. That means, sort of go for cross-state economic relations, people-to-people contact, and probably nudge them towards one country, two systems. But then again, the geopolitics there changed, and now Chinese have started to extreme coercion. To my way of looking at, I think they will exhaust Taiwanese with the passage of time and get back to them to accept one country, two systems. That is the way I think the things will pan out.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any comments? Right. Right. This brings us to the end of this session. It has been quite a lively session. We've heard diverse views. The whole point was to let people speak what their mind is. This is what democracies are about. We can have different views, and we must have different views. But on the point of General Cardozo, and I totally support that, when we are looking at China and when we are looking at trade, I think this is one of the weak points. And I think, and I've been writing about it whenever I can or publishing whatever I can, I think it is incumbent on the part of each and every Indian to boycott Chinese goods. The government cannot do it. We as the people can do it. But if you want to, if you go to the town and you see a toaster or something which is made in China, which is $500, and then a better one which is made, a similar one made in India, which is 800, you still buy the Chinese. We are supporting them and we are fighting them. So I think at some point of time, we as Indians have to make up our own mind. What do we want? It remains for me to thank all the panelists. General Lida sir, thank you so much. General Prakash Menon, Ambassador Ashok, and Dr. Arvind, thank you so much. And kindly join me in giving them a very warm round of applause. Thank you. I finished in time.